So feel free to send me feedback about Kahoot, how it goes, what you think about it, as far as the questions in general. Are they too easy? Are they too hard? Do they not make sense? Um, Also, another thing to be aware of is, well, two things really. Graded Assignment 3, Mars rover, the due date is today. I'll also mention that before studio review, but it's good to know. The other thing is I'm going to try to wrap up the lecture around 6:15 instead of the normal 6:30. And that's just because I want to give everyone extra time for the studio. I think it's a really fun studio, but the extra time will probably go a long way. All right, so we got 39 people in here, still counting. We'll give it a minute or two longer, and then we will jump in. I think this has audio. I don't know if we want the audio or not. All right, I think that's good. I'm gonna go ahead and start unless someone is just now jumping in. Yeah, we're good. All right, cool. So we're gonna be covering basically what we talked about recently, getting HTML. This is not relevant. What does the 57 represent on Heinz products? Also, I think you can join late if you see the pin at the bottom of the screen. Nice, that's a really good guess because Heinz was like 1880s, I think, when the company was started, but it was actually the number of pickle varieties advertised. So, wild fact. All right, this one's for points. When you create a new branch on your local machine, like your laptop, the branch is automatically added to GitHub. True or false? Nice. Okay, that's really good to see. Okay, this one is a fast answer. We have 10 seconds for this one. Which JavaScript method measures the length of a string or array? Ooh, so this is a trick question. There is no method that measures the length of arrays or strings. That's because the length is a property. And so if you notice the answer .length with the parentheses, how you'd actually do it is you drop the parentheses because you're not running a method, you're getting a property. Next question. Well, scoreboard is basically the same. Our trick question is lame. If anyone answers green, I'm not going to believe you. FYI. Okay, well, cool. Nice. True or false? ID attributes are normally assigned to more than one HTML element. A lot of people answering very quickly on this one. False, right. Classes are typically assigned to multiple HTML elements, but ID attributes are meant to be unique. So one at a time is essentially Got a new leader, Tim. Nice. Awesome. Blank conflicts can be caused when two separate branches edit the same file and then are later added to main. So you edit two branches, you get added to main, you might have a what conflict. Wow, okay. It's very solid. Yeah, merge conflicts. Last two questions are double points. Select all valid Git commands. Nice. Someone had to do the get out of here one. All right, cool. Last question. This is also for double points. What gets printed to the console when line 13 is read? And I'm sorry, this is kind of small. We have a function. First line of the function is return. Second line of the function is a console log statement. Then on line 13 is where we have the line that calls the function. So the question is, what gets printed to the console when line 13 is read? Nice. Right, so the reason why the console doesn't run is because the return statement happens first, and the return statement is basically like a stop sign for a function. Everything stops there, and so it never gets to the console. Congratulations, Ash. Who's Ash? Hey. All right, so this is where it gets kind of ridiculous. So we have this Ducky trophy, and there are 3 rarities, so we're going to find out which one is yours. Wow, legendary. That was like I think a 2 in 10 chance. Cool, so that's going to be happening every Thursday, give or take. All right, time to get serious. The lecture. Yeah, that was pretty fun. I got to turn off that music, though. And I should also switch back over to Chrome. Nothing's happening. I want to see here. Chrome. Slideshow. Text size, extra large. There we go. All right, cool. So, we're talking about some HTML stuff, some web stuff, the DOM, Document Object Model. Right, so accessing window and document info with JavaScript, sort of what we're going to be looking at here. So in JavaScript, the window object allows us to get the browser's information about the page. So an example of browser information would be like the URL, the width, the height of the browser, if it's Firefox, if it's Chrome. Has anyone here heard of the term browser fingerprinting? Okay, it's something that comes up probably if you're really interested in like cybersecurity and things like that. Browser fingerprinting essentially takes different attributes about the user's browser. They're able to uniquely identify them without needing them to log in. So for example, all of your browser settings that you have set up in maybe Firefox or whatever, the size of the browser window, all of the little details, if you put them all together, I think there was someone that said that puts your self at like a 1 in 7 million uniqueness. And so it's a very good way to identify people. And it's not really used for common use purposes. It's more used for like security stuff. So that's a ramble. I apologize. We'll get back on track. Cool. So that's the window. The window's path name, the size of it, and everything. Now we have the document. The document is essentially the HTML, right? So we have the things like the title of the web page. We have all of the elements in there, etc. So here's an illustration you've seen probably from the workbook of the document. So the document has the HTML, it has the head section, which has like your imports and stuff. It has the body section, which has your visible content. And so, question, we'll raise hands for this one. What is, in your own words, what is an event listener? What was that? Whenever a button's clicked? Okay. That's yes. Say that one more time.
It's essentially a function that waits for a certain action from the user.
A function that waits for a certain action from the user. Yes. I think that's a pretty good description of it. I think I lost my captions. Sweet. Right, so an event listener, we're going to talk a lot more about them, but they are waiting for something like a button click to happen. And then when a button click happens, it goes, oh, I should now go do something. Right, so I'm going to give an example of that with some code. So I made some really basic JavaScript and HTML code to demo this. If I move my mouse into the box, it says mouse entered the element. If I move my mouse out of the box, it says mouse left the element. Over here, I can click on this, and it says button clicked. Over here, I can type something in here, press enter, it shows up. And so somehow I have code that knows when my mouse enters the box, it knows when my mouse leaves the box, it knows when I click on this, etc. And not only does it know that, it does something about it. So let's look at that code and try to see what's happening. This is the wrong code. Right. That was the right code, but I actually got rid of it. All right. Cool. So we have three files that are represented for what we saw earlier. We have our HTML, we have our JavaScript, and we have our CSS. This is very normal when it comes to a website, having these three things, or variations of these three things, like multiples of them, etc. So this is what my HTML looks like. Let me see if I can make it. There we go. This is what my HTML looks like. I have my HTML element, which everything falls inside of. And then I have my head, which is the importing of like the CSS, importing the JavaScript. You have the title, if that matters, it probably doesn't matter. Then we have the body, which we have the actual button that we were clicking on. We have the actual input, that's where I was typing in. And then we had that box that was displaying everything I was doing. And so a few things to point out here is that really this is everything that was visible. That's one. Two, notice that all of these have IDs. I decided to give them IDs for a reason. Right, that's our HTML. Now let's look at the JavaScript. Okay, so this line up here, you can ignore it for a moment. We will talk about it. It's not critical here though. So the first thing I'm doing with my JavaScript is I am basically looking into the DOM, looking into the HTML and trying to find these elements I want to interact with. And so how I do it, as I say, document, it's basically the HTML. I don't have to import the document. JavaScript already knows what document is. I say document, I say get element, document dot, get element by ID. And then I pass in the ID as a string, and it finds that it matches up the string with the ID. So for example, this click button ID is the same as this click button ID, okay? So now I've essentially pulled that HTML element into my JavaScript, so now I can do fun stuff with it. So this is where I'm bringing I'm basically interacting with my HTML. And I do that the same for events, which is the box that was displaying what was happening. And I do the same for the input, which was where I was typing the words. Cool. Now for these various things, I am adding on an event listener. So I'm saying HTML element button, I'm going to add an event listener, and it's going to listen for click events. So there's a lot of things to listen for. I'm just saying listen for a click event. And then from there, I could do nothing. It could listen for the click event and do nothing. But I pass in a function, an anonymous function here. It doesn't have to be anonymous, but that's how I did it. And I am basically setting the text content of something else to be button clicked. So that text box, I'm setting the text of it. And so there's other event listeners here that are essentially doing something very similar. So let's look back again at the website. So remember that if I click this, there's an event listener waiting for me to click this button. When I click it, it fires off code that adds the button clicked text into this rectangle. If you notice when I move my mouse in here, it doesn't care. It's not listening for that event. If I move my mouse out, it's not listening for that event either. The only event it's listening for is me clicking on it. And when that happens, it hears a click, metaphorically, I guess, and then it does this. Right. So that's actually a pretty good picture of like the life cycle of how an event listener works. I'll pause here for questions on this. Yes.
What's the difference between inner HTML and text content?
Right. The difference between inner HTML. So the question was, what is the difference between inner HTML and text content? So I could say in here, I could say inner HTML, and it would work the same way. So that's essentially the question. So the difference is more of a security thing. Practically speaking, I'm setting whatever is inside of these two tags, this opening tag and this closing tag. With my JavaScript, I am changing the middle piece. But with my JavaScript, I could hypothetically put other HTML elements in there too. And so I could essentially say like, oh, add a paragraph in there, add a div in there, add a script in there, add all these different types of things. By just saying events.text content, I'm only able to add text content inside those two elements. And so the reason why that might matter for security is if your website is a public-facing website with access to data, someone could hypothetically use that to, I don't know, manipulate your website in some way. It's just a little bit more restrained in what it allows for. Yeah, great question.
Can you scroll up a little bit?
Scroll up? Yes.
So the document, does it just know that document means HTML? Or like why did you use the word document? Like is that why?
Right. So document is a keyword. It has to be that way. It has to be spelled that way. If I capitalize it, which I've seen myself do and students do, learners do, accidentally capitalizing it because it seems important enough to be capitalized, that will not reference the document. It has to be exactly like this. And so because my JavaScript is imported into this document, when it says document, it knows it's referring to this. And so the same will go for window. If we do any type of things with the window, this is an object that we have access to. And to illustrate this a little bit better, I'm going to do something. I'm going to say console.log document. It gave me too much. Console.log document. Now, let's look at you can see the console in the inspector since we're dealing with web stuff now. I'm going to reload this, and it gives me this giant object. And there's a lot of stuff on here. And if I click on different things, it'll expand and there'll be more things. This is essentially, when we say document JavaScript, we have access to all of this mess. It looks like a mess from here. Which is super useful if we want to do cool things on a website. Yeah, great question. Yes.
Let's say that you add a bunch of buttons where you want them to behave the same way, like you want them to all be hovered over the same way, but one actual function of them to be different. You do the same thing with the event listener with the class, like as you do with ID.
So an event listener is attached to a specific element. And so for each element that you want to have events listened for on, it's going to be a different event listener. You might be able to do something with a loop to do it, but essentially they're all going to be their own event listeners. Does that answer your question? Cool, awesome. Other questions? No? Okay. Let's jump back into the presentation. And we will go, I should learn the shortcuts for this. Thanks. Sweet. Okay, so here's a question you may have not been asked before. What happens when JavaScript attempts to attach an event listener to an HTML element before the HTML is loaded? Let's say the JavaScript loads first, the HTML has not loaded yet, and JavaScript tries to attach an event listener to some HTML element that hasn't been loaded yet. What do we think will happen? Think it will work? How about this? If you think it will work once everything loads, raise your hand. And if you think it won't work when everything loads, raise your hand. If you think it will work, we'll start with this. Sorry, I'm being pretty chaotic. If you think it will work when everything loads, raise your hand. Got a couple yeses? Now, your hands down. If you think it won't work when everything loads, raise your hand. Okay, we're leaning towards it won't work. The correct answer is it in fact won't work. Thank you for having the courage to raise your hands. We haven't done this one before, but I think it's a good thing. We might try doing more often. Anyways, so the reason why it crashes and burns is because when, I'll just show us real quick. This step right here, before we can attach an event listener, we have to get the HTML element. And if we can't get the HTML element because it's not there, then we're trying to attach an event listener to something that's undefined. And then that's where it crashes and burns, or where it fails, right? So, right. And that's actually a hint as to why we have this line of code up here, which is what we will talk about here in a moment. Right, view, slideshow, all the things. I wish I would remember the fact that I want captions on. Maybe there's a setting. Right, so here is a solution if we do not want to accidentally attach an event listener to an HTML element before everything's loaded. The solution is we could put our JavaScript import line of code underneath all the HTML elements. So when the HTML file loads, it loads up all the elements, and then it gets to our script, and then our script runs, and everything's already there. It's all good, right? Common solution, you'll see this a lot. In my opinion, there is a better solution, and that's to handle it with JavaScript. So we can access the window object and say, add event listener to the entire window, and say, window, when you have loaded everything, then run the JavaScript. And so this is handling it programmatically. At least both ways are programmatically, but I think you understand what I'm getting at. I don't know why captions are failing me. So that's a solution. Another solution, which I think is even better. So solution A, better solution, best solution. Best solution, in my opinion, is to use document.add event listener DOM content loaded. What is the difference? What is the difference between this and this? So when we wait for the page to load, it is going to wait for everything to load. That means pictures, videos, all kinds of content. If it's a large website, it may take a long time for your JavaScript to be able to do anything because you're waiting for maybe a large video to load up. With DOM content loaded, it doesn't wait for those extra things. All it waits for is the DOM, the document object model, the HTML, the bare bones. It's waiting for that to be loaded, and then your JavaScript will run. So don't need to memorize these things, but it's really good to know that these solutions exist. I honestly didn't know about these two options until I had been coding for quite a while. Right, so actually, let me pause at this slide. Questions? Any questions? Yes?
Trying to be outside the scope of what
Sure.
we're trying to learn. What is async and await? Do those have something to do with this?
What is async and await? I don't think they'll have much to do with what we're doing right now. To explain what async await is in JavaScript, so when we run our JavaScript code, it runs top to bottom. It runs synchronously. And so when we call a function, that function runs before anything else happens. It's like the code stops, it waits for the function to run. It's just how it works. It's synchronous code. Asynchronous code is for when we need to do things, unique things, that might take some time, and we don't want to interrupt our code for that to finish. Or we do want our code to wait until that's finished. So, for example, if we're running our code, we can have everything happen synchronously, but then let's say we wanted to call data from an external website. Maybe that happens in a millisecond, maybe it takes 5 seconds. We don't know how long it's going to take. Using an async function, we could hypothetically say, okay, I'm going to make an asynchronous call to get this data from this website, and I'm going to wait for that data to get back. And once that data gets back, I'll do stuff with it. If JavaScript did not have this async await thing that you're referring to, when we called data from like an external source that took 5 seconds, our code would be long past it. There would be no way to do anything with that data because the code wouldn't wait for it. So I'm sure that this will come up later in the learning, but yeah, good question. Cool. Other questions? Yes.
Those things like load and content loaded and like button click, mouse over, are those things that you're defining, or are those like already established?
These things are established basically by the browser specifications.
Okay.
So because we're in the environment of a web browser, we're inheriting a lot of stuff. Yeah. So yeah, the question was, am I the developer defining DOM content loaded? Am I defining what a click is? No, I don't need to define those things. the JavaScript will already know what it is because the web browser is feeding us that information. If we were to run all this in just a terminal and like a node thing, like what we were doing on Replit, in Replit we weren't technically in a web environment, and so we didn't have access to these things. Since we're dealing with web stuff, we now have access to these things. It's the context, if that makes any sense. Hopefully that wasn't more confusing than it needed to be. A keyword? DOM content loaded, what would I call that? I don't know if I would call it a keyword. I might call it a property. Document, I would consider, I would consider that an object name. I don't know if I would necessarily, I don't know if I would call it a keyword, but it's like an object that we are assumed to have access to. Add event listener is a method of the document object or document class object, depending on how you define it. Cool. Right, so the presentation now looks different. The reason why is because I taught this class a couple years ago, and I had a very different approach to this class then, but we're going to basically do that presentation inside of this presentation, if that makes sense. I'm going to skip some of this. Just to reiterate, so when we click on a button, the action of clicking is an event, and so we can run code when that event happens with an event listener. So we have a code example, writing an event listener to a button, and so every time we click on the button, it will print the message "Hello World" in this example because we have our console on. Also, to reiterate and to sort of simplify the general concept, there are two things that need to be in place to get an event listener to work in JavaScript. Number one, we need to find the HTML element we want to attach the listener to. And so that's where we're trying to select the element using something like document.getElementById or some other type of selector. So we first need to select the thing we want to attach the listener to, and then we need to attach the listener. So those are the two pieces of the puzzle. Here's one more example. We have a button, our HTML is at the top, and so the ID is the red button. Down here in our JavaScript, we get that element, and then after we get the element, now we can add the event listener. You might see this done all in one line, so instead of creating a variable, it could be something like document.getElementById, the ID, .add event listener, everything all in one row. I don't really like doing it that way. I like keeping those two steps separate. Right, and so here's why I really want to pull up this presentation. This is a very different way of thinking about things from a teaching perspective, but what I want to do here is sort of just show like probably 80% of the relevant event listeners that are actually out there. And so my goal is to essentially not so that you learn all of these, but so that you have like an intuition about what you can and can't do with event listeners. And so I created something called the periodic table of events in JavaScript. And so this is not like perfect. You know, there's some categories that are a little wonky, but it's pretty good. Right, so with event listeners, we can break them out into a couple different categories. We have user interaction events. We have window events, things happening just to the window in general. We have form and text events. So if you imagine yourself logging into a website or signing up for something, you're usually interacting with a form. There's events specific to those forms. And then we have file reader events. That's like if you need to upload or download a file of a file reader event. There's some other events that didn't really fit into those categories. Then we have a small category for SVG animation. We'll talk about that soon. Really want the captions to work. They don't seem to want to work. Cool. So if you kind of look at how we're doing this, so this is the this is everything that we're going to be looking at briefly, and then we're zooming into this one section up here. And these are the user interaction events. And so in the user interaction events, we'll call this like a room or whatever in this room, we have click events. So we have just the click event that we looked at earlier. We have a double click event. We have an aux click event. Aux click would be like right click right click. Key up, key down, touch start. So this is different than someone clicking with a mouse. This is someone touching with a touch screen. And then we have something that combines a touch screen with a click event, and that is pointer down. So pointer down will capture an event from both a touch screen and from a mouse. Also, we have something called focus. Focus is triggered when an item is in focus. So if you've ever noticed, like when you click on something, it sort of outlines it. That's in focus. Or if you selected some text, that text is in focus. And we also have a scroll event. So every time you scroll on the page, the scroll event is firing. I guess I didn't need to go through all those like that. Where you can zoom in on them each individually. That's cool. Mouse enter, mouse leave. That's what we saw earlier. Mouse over, mouse out. We have this similar to the mouse events. We have corresponding pointer events. The mouse events existed before touchscreens were popular, and so pointer events is probably better to use, but they're probably in less online examples. So this is really good to know that it exists. Cool. So that was user interaction events. Now we're going to kind of look at the form and text events room, all the different things in here. General categories are events for when a form is submitted, events for when information is inputted, composition updates, I'm not sure what that is. We'll probably see it in the other slide. And then select events where someone selects something on the screen. I guess that's all we have. Sorry, it's been a minute since I've gone through this. These are really cool. So if you remember when we were talking earlier, we had the document, we had the window. For window events, so you have like window.addEventListener and you have document.addEventListener. For the window events, we have online and offline. And so this is a really interesting thing for when the user gains or loses internet. Has anyone ever seen the dinosaur game in Chrome when you lose internet? I wonder what event listener they might be using, right? Here, in my opinion, is more of an annoying one. There's page show, page hide. So if someone navigates away from the page or switch tabs or whatever, it will trigger the event listener page show or page hide. And so the page might try to do something when you try to leave it, which I think is kind of dumb, but that's just me. We have an event listener for when someone tries to print something. So if they try to print the web page, there's an event listener for that. A really cool one is you can detect if a gamepad was connected. So if you've ever done like online streaming and it recognizes that you connected the gamepad, it's probably using the gamepad connected event listener. So imagine if you're creating like an online game and you could also like capture gamepad stuff. That'd be pretty cool. Some other window events we have copy, cut, paste. We capture those events. Device motion and device orientation. So think about like a mobile phone, like an iPhone, where you switch it sideways. You can capture those events and do something with that. You can detect if the user changes the language, their preferred language in the browser. So if they change it from English to something else, etc. And that might be really useful, especially for your website and you think it's something that's going to be used by non-English speakers. We have full screen, resize, full screen error, all these other fun things. We already talked about load. That's essentially when the entire web page loads. File reader events. We mentioned these briefly. This is uploading, downloading events. If you notice, there is a progress event here. So if you ever wanted to create a loading screen for uploading and downloading, the progress event might be very useful. You can also detect if there's an error downloading. I included SVG animations in this presentation. I don't know how many of us have heard of SVGs, or has anyone heard of SVG before? Yes, cool. SVGs are essentially, they're different than a normal image. Normal image is made up of just pixel values, and SVG is like a mathematical shape. And so they're extremely lightweight. And so if you were to create a logo with an SVG, you could probably get it down to like a kilobyte or less, somewhere in like just the kilobytes range, where to get the same resolution with a PNG would be several megabytes. And so I like SVGs because you can animate them, you can do a lot of things with them, and they're great if you're thinking in terms of accessibility. So, pardon the tangent, Google has this idea of the next billion users of the internet. And essentially the concept is that they believe the next billion people to join the internet are going to be people from developing countries. And therefore, Google realizes that these websites that require a really fast internet connection just to be able to use, those aren't going to be accessible. So things like using SVGs can make a website a lot more accessible, whereas not even thinking about it, just putting an image up on a website that is, 5 megabytes, you can basically mitigate that. Some honorable mentions. There's event listeners for when an animation starts and stops, when someone drags something, visibility change, device change, just a lot of really cool stuff. You can find a lot more about this on Mozilla, W3 Schools, and then also we have our own workbook chapter on this stuff. Cool. So, like I was hoping to, we're close to 6:15, so we'll have time for a couple questions. But to reiterate, graded assignment 3 is due today. That's Mars rover. The next one that is due is the HTML me something assignment. That's graded assignment number 4, and that will be due on March 2nd. So, before we break out for studio, questions on the lecture, questions on event listeners, JavaScript, yes. The downside of using an SVG over a PNG is if you were to try to create an SVG, they're a little bit harder to work with. So the creation process is a bit more challenging, but in my opinion, the actual application of using them, there's not a lot of downsides. Yeah. There's another question I thought I saw. No? Okay. Cool. Yes?
If you are using like the event listeners to change just the styles of elements, is there a benefit for using JavaScript to do that over a CSS pseudo class?
Right. So the question is, there are contexts in which you can kind of conditionally change the styles of an element, and you can accomplish this with CSS. For example, CSS has like a hover selector, so it can tell if your mouse is hovering over an item, and you can change the style that way. JavaScript, on the other hand, you could also do the same thing. You could detect if a mouse is hovering over the item, and you could change its styles that way. My recommendation would be, although you could do the same thing with both, to prefer using CSS unless what you're building is complex enough that CSS can't solve it. Because when you bring in the JavaScript component, there'll be more performance requirements, and it'll be more complicated. The code will be a bit messier. Whereas with CSS, it'll happen very fast, and it's already very efficient. Right, great question.
Was there one of those hover elements over the button on the example that you showed earlier?
I don't know that there was.
Like how it turns gray?
Oh, right, that would be CSS.
Okay, because I was going to ask about that earlier. Okay, cool.
I didn't show the CSS. I'll show that real quick, and then we'll break for studio. That actually might be built into the browser. Hold on. Yeah, I didn't have to code that, but I could have if I wanted to.
Okay.
Right, that was built in.
But would that be like that question?
Exactly.
Okay, cool.
Sweet. Thanks for the great questions. And we'll go ahead and break for studio and see you back here at 8.